Contents 1 American expansion and removal 2 the Sauk and Meskwaki in Illinois 3 Diplomacy and conflict on the upper Mississippi River 4 Sauk leadership fragments 5 The onset of war 6 The road to the Bad Axe River 7 After the Black Hawk War 8 Icons and Indians in the United States Chronology and timeline 1. American expansion and removal. President Andrew Jackson delivered Ms. first annual address nearly decades after the end of the American Revolution. In his speech, he explained how federal Indian policy often contradicted itself during those early years of the nation. It has long been the policy of government to introduce among them the arts of civilization, he asserted, in the hope of gradually reclaiming them from a wandering life. This policy has, however, been coupled with another wholly incompatible with its success. Professing a desire to civilize and settle them, we have at the same time lost no opportunity to purchase their lands and thrust them farther into the wilderness. Axon's speech summarized well the problems of federal policy up to that point in time. But the president also used the opportunity to set the stage for a new policy focused on removal. This policy would address one of the key issues that had not been acted upon by the country's leaders: the relationship between the new nation and its original inhabitants. In the late 1780s, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others had successfully drafted and promoted the Constitution, which became the framework for the new republic. The country's leaders quickly addressed some of the more critical issues, but they left others to future leaders to debate and resolve. Months of debate led to a government built on the powers of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. At the same time, these leaders avoided making any definitive statements on other issues, notably slavery. In addition, both federal officials and U.S. citizens were undecided over the proper place of Indian tribes and individuals within the new nation. From the American Revolution onward, the United States struggled to define and state its core principles. What would be the policy of the young country toward the Indians living east and west of the Appalachian Mountains? Many Eastern Indians had allied with the British during the American Revolution. These Indians had hoped that their efforts could halt the advance of Anglo-American settlers. However, the American victory meant that the Cherokee, Shawnee, Iroquois, Delaware, and other tribes would have to negotiate with the new nation on the continent. And U.S. officials had to decide where those same Indians would tie into this new nation. Numerous voices contributed to this debate. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris brought an end to the American Revolution. In I-830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. During the decades in between, presidents, cabinet members, congressmen, and Indian leaders all had their say. They talked about who owned the land and who had the right to sell the land. Most important, they debated whether Americans and Indians could peacefully coexist. Not only did Indians and Americans rarely see eye to eye, but there was also disagreement within Anglo-America itself. And yet, federal officials and U.S. citizens did support a few basic points. First, all non-Indian residents of the eastern states and the growing western territories agreed that some solution was necessary to establish peaceful relations between the two peoples. Second, they recognized that land use and land ownership were the central causes of conflict. Third, and finally, all non-Indians believed that the U.S. government and the American people knew what was best for the Indians. Despite these points of agreement, early Indian policy was not always consistent. From the 1780s to the 1820s, the U.S. government instituted several different plans, but land policies, government trading houses, and missionary work did not resolve the most pressing issue. Cherokee, Creek, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and other Indian communities still lived on lands coveted by American settlers. By the late 1820s, many Americans believed that the removal of Eastern Indian tribes presented the best and only solution to this problem. Federal Indian policy. Federal policy in the decades after the American Revolution wreaked the larger debates among U.S. officials and citizens regarding American Indians. From the administration of George Washington to that of James Monroe, the discussions revolved around the Western territories, the fur trade, and the prevailing views about civilization. At the end of the American Revolution, the new government was in debt and did not have a powerful army. Thousands of its citizens also wanted to settle the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British government had once attempted to restrict the expansion of the colonies. But the defeat of the British meant that such restrictions had been removed. All of these circumstances influenced the U.S. government's approach to Indian affairs from the 1780s forward. Due to the debt incurred by the American Revolution, the U.S. government needed a way to generate revenue. As a result, Congress adopted the Land Ordinance of 1785. Under the plan, the U.S. government sold land to those citizens who wished to move to what became known as the Northwest Territory, the present-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Mid-Waukegan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. To pay its debts and satisfy its citizens, the federal government chose to survey and sell western lands. Two specific pieces of legislation established the particulars of the policies. The Land Ordinance of 1785 established a procedure for the survey of townships that were each 36 square miles. The townships were further divided into 1 square mile sections. These sections of land would be given to American veterans of the Revolution, and the remaining sections were sold at public auction and the government received the profits. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 built upon the 1785 legislation, providing for the organization of 3 VE states out of the Northwest Territory. The territory targeted by this ordinance eventually became the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. When Congress passed these two land ordinances, one significant problem remained. In the 1780s, the lands encompassed by the Northwest Territory were still claimed by Shawnee Delaware, Potawatomi, ///Yandoti, and other Indian tribes. Secretary of War Henry Knox argued that the United States did not have the strength to GHT those Indians, nor could the U.S. government prevent white settlers from moving into the Northwest Territory. Knox recommended that federal officials sign treaties with the Indians for their land. But the treaties signed in the 1780s did not persuade Ohio Indians to surrender their claims to the land. Instead, they resisted the arrival of Anglo-American settlers over the following decade. In the 1790s, the U.S. government initiated a second set of policies intended to improve relations between the two groups. Congress approved the Trade and Intercourse Act in 1790 and passed several revised versions of that legislation throughout the following several decades. These laws targeted the interaction between U.S. citizens and American Indians. They regulated trade relations, criminal actions, and trespassing on Indian lands. These laws also made the federal government the ultimate authority in Indian affairs. Related policies illustrated two other important trends. First, U.S. officials wanted to undermine the Indians of British and Spanish traders by establishing a series of trading posts funded and operated by the government. These posts were established so that Indians would become better friends with the U.S. government, which could better control Indian access to goods. A series of more than 20 trading posts operated between 1795 and 1822, but the quality of the goods at these posts could never match that of the British merchants. Thus this system was never a financial success. IHE's second related policy focused on converting Indians to Western ideas about civilization. In 1791, President George Washington promoted a system corresponding with the mild principles of religion and philanthropy toward the Indians. During the following 3 decades, both federal officials and Christian missionaries acted on this vision. Missionaries from several different Christian denominations lived and worked with Indian tribes throughout the eastern United States and tried to persuade those communities to change their way of life. These men and women wanted Indians to convert to Christianity and rely more on agriculture for their subsistence. In 1819, Congress passed the Civilization Fund Act, which provided money to support these efforts. Regional encounters and support for removal. By the 1820s, the Anglo-American public began to support the concept of removal. It had been a gradual process. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the United States and led Thomas Jefferson to suggest that the Western territories could provide a new home for Eastern Indians. The idea gained strength throughout the rest 3 decades of the 19th century, with numerous events contributing to the growing support. One was the failure of the government's trading post system. Another important factor was the continued resistance of Indian leaders and tribes to American expansion. However, the reasons for supporting Indian removal were generally the same throughout the country. From the Ohio Valley to Georgia, Americans favored this legislation because they wanted the tribes' lands. In the North, the conflicts of the late 1700s and early 1800s, as well as the desire for land, made settlers in the region push for the relocation of the Potawatomis, Shawnees, Delawares, and Wyandots. A similar desire for land and the rise of cotton farming fueled the calls for the removal of Cherokees, Creeks, and Choctaws in the southern states. In the late 1780s, the Shawnee, Miami, Potawatomi, and other Indian tribes in the Northwest Territory formed a military alliance against Anglo-American expansion. They wanted white settlements to stay south of the Ohio River. The councils that planned this resistance included representatives from tribes in the Great Lakes region and the Southeast. Thus, this alliance of Eastern Indians was both strong and diverse. 2 different American armies suffered significant defeats in the early 1790s before General Anthony Vane Nally subdued the Indian Confederates at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in I-794. The Treaty of Greenville officially ended that conflict in I-795. In this agreement, the Northern Indians surrendered most of present-day Ohio. The Miami leader Little Turtle criticized American land hunger, and noted, "Your younger brothers are of the opinion you take too much of their lands away and convey the hunting of our young men with the limits too contracted." The Northern Indians united again in the early 1800s. 2 Shawnee Indians inspired and led this confederacy. In I-806, the Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa began to preach against the evils of the white man's ways. He told his followers to reject the material goods and Christianity of the Americans. His brother Tecumseh was the political leader of this alliance. Tecumseh traveled throughout the eastern half of the New Nation to rally resistance to the intrusions of American settlers. This confederacy also suffered defeat. The most significant loss occurred in 1811, when an army under William Henry Harrison attacked and overwhelmed the Indian forces at the Battle of Tippecanoe. However, defeat at the Battle of Tippecanoe did not end the conflict for those who had supported Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. From 1812 through 1814, Indians in the Great Lakes region fought with the British against the Americans in the War of 1812. Indian forces contributed heavily to the capture of Forts Dearborn, Mackinac, and Detroit early in the war. Despite these victories, American forces under Harrison controlled the western Great Lakes region by the beginning of 1814. Yet pockets of Indian resistance still remained in villages throughout the upper Mississippi Valley. American and British officials signed a peace treaty in December 1814, but this accord did not end the relationships between Great Lakes Indian tribes and British traders. The end of the Indian Confederacy and the War of 1812 had 2 results. First, military defeats led to treaties that established peace and opened lands to white settlement. By the late 1810s, thousands of settlers had flooded the Ohio Valley and lands farther west. Consequently, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois gained statehood between 1803 and 1818. The formation of these states and the growing Anglo-American population escalated the calls to negotiate for Indian lands. By the N1ID 1820s, most of the Delawares and Shawnees had already signed treaties, left the Ohio Valley, and crossed the Mississippi. The Miamis, Potawatomis, Ottawas, and Wyandots who remained were under constant pressure to give up their lands. And as American expansion reached the banks of the Mississippi River, Ho-Chunk, Sauk, Meskwaki, and Menominee Indians realized that their villages were also threatened. Another important impact of the conflicts of the early 1800s was connected to Anglo-American ideas about Indians. In part, Americans believed that the Indians' resistance to the settlement of the Ohio Valley showed that Indians would never change. Tecumseh's heroic reputation grew because he had fought nobly and did not compromise his beliefs. He had been a worthy enemy. However, after his death in 1813, he and his people became part of history. In short, many American residents of the Ohio Valley did not believe that whites and Indians could peacefully coexist. Any further conflict would only reinforce this belief. Removal, therefore, would be the best way to handle any Indians who still claimed land in the region. The desire for land also fueled demands for removal in the southeast. Citizens and officials of southern states attempted to obtain as much Indian territory as possible in the decades after the American Revolution. The push for land in the 1800s was directly attached to the development of cotton as a cash crop. Agriculture supported by slave labor became the core of the Southern economy in the early 19th century. Perhaps more than any other factor, this development helps explain the widespread support for Indian removal in the region. Many southeastern Indian tribes suffered great losses during the American Revolution. At the beginning of the conflict, few Indian leaders believed that they should side with the colonists. They realized that an American victory would lead to increased expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains. Therefore, most southeastern Indians chose between allying with the British and staying neutral. In many instances the choice did not matter. Attacks made by American militias in the RST years of the war often drove neutral Indians into alliances with the British. Indian and British forces did not GHT together in the southeast for very long. The Chickamauga Cherokees under Dragging Canoe continued to battle American militias after other Cherokees had negotiated a peace in I-777. For the most part, Indian participation in the war moved north of the Ohio River after the RST 2 years. And once the American Revolution ended, the newly independent U.S. government focused its military efforts on the Ohio Valley. In the southeast, federal officials chose to negotiate treaties to maintain the peace. They hoped to ensure that settlers would respect Indian boundaries. In the decades after the American Revolution, federal officials tried to balance the land hunger of the southern states with the needs of the southeastern Indians. The southern states were the victors. Between 1798 and 1806, Cherokee leaders signed different treaties that ceded territory in Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and North Carolina. Shortly thereafter, a civil war within the Creek Nation made local American citizens nervous. General Andrew Jackson eased their concerns by defeating a force of Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. He then imposed a treaty on the entire Creek Nation that forced them to surrender about 23 million acres of land to the United States. This 1814 treaty opened up fertile lands at a time when farmers in the South had begun to plant cotton in greater quantities than ever before. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had made it easier to separate seeds from cotton burrs, and the resulting increase in cotton production led to an increased reliance on African American slave labor in the Elds. But cotton quickly drained nutrients from the soil. As a result, planters always required more land. Fortunately for cotton growers, the fertile soil in Georgia and the territory that became Alabama and Mississippi was well suited to growing cotton. Established planters and hopeful settlers therefore quickly took advantage of the 1814 treaty. Between 1816 and 1820, tens of thousands of Americans entered the region. The population of Alabama alone skyrocketed from 9,046 in 1810 to 127,901 in 1820. These eager masses demanded that the U.S. government open up more land. The Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees stood in their way. American expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains occurred rapidly in the RST decades of the 19th century. Indian tribes in the Great Lakes region and the Southeast struggled to deal with this invasion. From the American Revolution to the 1820s, these Indians faced an inexperienced U.S. government that tried a number of policies. American officials attempted to regulate trade, contain its citizens, negotiate treaties, and promote conversion to Christianity. In the end, However, all of these policies focused on obtaining Indian lands. As a result, while the conflicts over territory in the eastern half of the United States had different specific causes, the calls for removal in the 1820s were very similar. Conclusion: Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in May 1830. The vote was a close one. Several congressmen spoke out passionately against the legislation. Thousands of American men and women also protested this decision to make removal an official policy. However, this opposition did not change the outcome. The federal government had the authority to negotiate with Indians for their lands east of the Mississippi River, and treaty commissioners could arrange for Indian relocation to the Western Territories. Support for removal had different origins in the Old Northwest and the Southeast. The policy also had diverse impacts throughout the country. In the Southeast, the Cherokees led the most well-known resistance to land cessions and removal, taking the GHT all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Throughout the Old Northwest, bands of Indians struggled to hold on to small pieces of land. Although some moved by choice, most were forced to move. One of the most famous episodes of forced removal occurred in the summer of I-832. From April to September of that year, a band of Sauks and Meskwakes attempted to defend their lands east of the Mississippi from the growing population of American settlers in northeastern Illinois. A 65-year-old warrior named Black Hawk served as their leader and their spokesman. The resulting conflict, known as the Black Hawk War, forced the surviving Sauks and Meskwakes west of the Mississippi and secured the region for Anglo-American settlement. By passing the Indian Removal Act, Congress made an important point clear. Decades of different government policies and conflict had led to one conclusion. The United States and its citizens had decided that American Indians did not have a place in the future of the country. Instead, Indians needed to surrender their lands and move peacefully out of the way. 2. The Sauk and Meskwake in Illinois. Only months had passed since the end or the conflict known to many as the Black Hawk War. Now Black Hawk, a Sauk Indian, had decided to narrate the events in his life leading up to the 1830s. It was important to him that the American people learn why he had acted as he did in the summer of 1832. He began the story of his life with two direct statements. I was born at the Sac Village, on Rock River, in the year 1767, and am now in my 67th year. My great-grandfather, Ananamaki, or Thunder, was born in the vicinity of Montreal, where the Great Spirit Rst placed the Sac Nation, and inspired him with a belief that, at the end of 4 years, he should see a white man, who would be to him a father. Black Hawk understood a basic but important point. The violence and misunderstandings of the summer of 1832 were rooted in numerous events of prior years. As told by Black Hawk and noted by others of the time, the Sauk Indians had a long history with the French and British well before the American colonies gained their independence. Therefore, the relationship between the Sauk Indians and the United States was affected by decades of trade, diplomacy, and hostility. Alternating periods of war and peace marked the Sauk Indians' dealings with the European newcomers from the 1600s to the early 1800s. But the relationship with the British had a particular impact on the ways in which the Sauks dealt with the people of the United States. Even as the young country established a strong foothold in the Ohio Valley in the RST decades of the 19th century, Black Hawk and his people maintained a strong friendship with the British in Canada. Early Sauk and Meskwake history. The Sauk Indians were relative newcomers to the upper Mississippi Valley. Indeed, Black Hawk's great-grandfather had been born near Montreal. This early history was important for two reasons. First, the westward migrations of the Sauk from the early 1600s to the 1800s reveal how they came to live in Illinois. Second, those same migrations reveal even more about their encounters with different European nations, as well as their relations with other Indian tribes. In 1611, when the French explorer Samuel de Champlain Rst arrived near what became the city of Montreal, he may very well have met Black Hawk's great-grandfather. However, the Sauk Indians did not stay in the area much longer. Like other eastern Indian residents of the Great Lakes region, the Sauk were affected by the Iroquois Wars. From the 164 OS to the end of the century, the five nations of the Iroquois Confederacy engaged in extensive warfare to obtain more land west of their original homelands south of Lake Ontario and west of the Hudson River. The Iroquois were driven primarily by their desire to control the profitable beaver pelt trade between the Western Indians and the French in Montreal. Because they had depleted the animal population in their home territory in upstate New York, the Iroquois fought to obtain the harvest of furs from more bountiful lands. IE's ongoing conflict gradually pushed the Sauks away from their homes on Saginaw Bay. Several decades after the arrival of the French, Sauk villages were found on Saginaw Bay in present-day eastern Michigan. More significant migrations soon followed. By the end of the 17th century, they had established villages throughout the region that became Illinois and Wisconsin. Safe from harassment by the Iroquois, the Sauks and their Potawatomi and Meskwaka neighbors could still trade with the Frenchmen who piloted their boats to posts at Green Bay and other western locations. Beginning in the early 1700s, however, the relationship between the Meskwaka Indians and the French soured. The French, who referred to the Meskwaka as the Reynard, or Fox Indians, wanted to weaken Meskwaka participation in the fur trade. By the 1710s, the French joined the Huron, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes around Detroit in a war intended to eliminate the Meskwaka presence in the region. Although the Sauks initially allied with the French, they became upset with the Europeans' vision of total warfare. Sauk leaders feared that the elimination of the Meskwaka might lead to similar campaigns against other Indian tribes. As a result, the Sauks began to work with the Meskwakes. Warriors of these two nations fought the French and pushed south to expand their territory at the expense of the Indians in what is today Illinois. This alliance between the Sauk and Meskwaka in the early 18th century had several consequences. First, the military cooperation led to villages built closer together and intermarriage between men and women of the two communities. Second, the Sauks shared in the negative impacts of the French expeditions. As attacks by the French and their allies continued into the 1730s, the Sauks and Meskwakes moved farther west and established villages farther inland. Although they still traded with the Frenchmen at Green Bay, their new homes were now on the Wisconsin, Rock, and Mississippi rivers. These years also created a foundation for misunderstandings about the relationship between the Sauks and Meskwakes. Although military alliances and intermarriage brought these two communities closer, they had their differences, too. The Sauks called themselves Ozakawuji, or the Yellow Earth People. The Meskwakes referred to themselves as the Red Earth People. Their languages were similar and they shared living styles and subsistence patterns. However, these common traits and customs did not make for a common nation. By the end of the 18th century, the world of the Sauks and Meskwakes had changed dramatically. The French, 24, no longer had a significant presence in the Great Lakes region after their loss to the British in the 7 Years' War. The Sauk Indians and their neighbors at this time traveled to Green Bay and Michilimackinac to obtain goods from the British traders. Beginning in 1781, they could also trade at Prairie du Chien. This friendship with the British only Nabinamoata Sauk history during a journey from Chicago to Prairie du Chien in the summer of 1823, a professor from the University of Pennsylvania named William Keating spoke at length with the expedition's guide, a Sauk Indian named Wenabinamoata. The following excerpt is part of Keating's record of their conversations about Sauk history. They are a brave, warlike, and, as far as we could learn, a generous people. The great reduction in their numbers arose from their hostility to the French and their alum, and also to the wars which they formerly waged against the Indians on the Missouri and Mississippi, such as the Pawnee, the Omahas, the Sioux, the Iowas, 8 RC. Owing to the rapid advance of the white population, and the increasing influence of our government over them, they are becoming more peaceable, and from this circumstance their numbers are probably on the increase. Their historical recollections do not extend far back, but they have been told that about 60 years since, when the French occupied the country, one of the Saul I chiefs, found himself surrounded with about 60 of his nation by a party of French and Indians, belonging to other tribes, amounting altogether to 2,000. Menedimet then addressed his men, bidding them not to fear, for he had been favored with a vision from the Great Spirit that informed him that if they all grew stronger in the years after the American Revolution, attacks by U.S. militias in 1780 fostered anti-American feelings among the Indians in the region. And once the war ended between Great Britain and its former colonies, Anglo-American settlers moved into the western Great Lakes in increasing numbers. Fought bravely, not one of them should perish. Encouraged by this assertion, they fought with such desperation as to break the ranks of and escape without the loss of a single man. Their numbers have since considerably increased, as according to his estimate, the nation now consists of upwards of 1,000 warriors. In this number are included all the active, able-bodied, and middle-aged part of the nation. This great accession to their numbers results principally from their system of adopting their prisoners of war. The Fox Nation, which appears to be very closely united with the Sauk, was at that time likewise much reduced. It is stated that at one time there were but 3 lodges of Fox Indians left. These reports are probably in some respects exaggerated. The Sauks have not always resided where they are at present found. Their recollection is that they formerly lived upon Saginaw Bay of Lake Huron, and that about 50 years since they removed, by the way of Green Bay, from the lake shore to their present abode. They seem to consider the name of their nation to be connected with that of Saginaw Bay, and probably derived from it. They have no account of any former migration, but entertain the opinion that the Great Spirit created them in that vicinity. The 1804 Treaty. As mentioned earlier, in the decades after the American Revolution, the U.S. government focused its efforts on the Ohio Valley. This was most evident in the military expeditions of the 1780s and 1790s against the Indian Confederacy under the Miami leader Little Turtle. But this movement into the Northwest Territory also had an impact on the lands farther west. U.S. officials knew that wars were expensive, and they did not want to GHT the Sauks and their neighbors. Therefore, they tried to use peace and diplomacy to establish a presence in the Mississippi Valley. 2 important factors influenced how the Americans approached the Sauk Indians in the early 19th century. First, in the spring of 1803, the United States paid the French $15 million for the Louisiana Territory. This purchase doubled the size of the young nation, and at the same time it removed both the Spanish and French from the upper Mississippi Valley. The United States could now claim both sides of the river. The second factor in the U.S. treatment of the Sauk Indians was related to this purchase. President Thomas Jefferson had a opinion about how the United States should use the newly acquired territory. Indeed, he believed that the western lands offered an opportunity for Indians and Americans alike. The growing U.S. population needed more land for its farms and settlements. At the same time, Indians suffered from the encroachments of settlers and the diseases and vices that came with that contact. Both populations would benefit if the Indians simply surrendered their lands and moved west. But this vision relied on the Indians' willingness to give up their territory. Jefferson had a solution for that problem. Writing to William Henry Harrison in 1803, Jefferson outlined one part of his strategy. In an attempt to avoid wars of conquest, the United States would use trade relations to accomplish its goals. "We shall push our trading houses," he explained, "and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands." In other words, federal officials were encouraged to use whatever means necessary to convince Indian leaders to cede lands east of the Mississippi River. Harrison, the governor of Indiana Territory from 1801 to 1813, took Jefferson's words to heart. Until 1809, Indiana Territory encompassed most of present-day Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, which included the lands of the Sauks, Meskwakes, Potawatomis, and others. Harrison was a military officer who had fought against the Indian Confederacy in the Ohio Valley in the 1790s. After he assumed his government post, he used councils and treaties to obtain Indian lands. In the case of the Sauks, Harrison did not deal with trade debts in an attempt to push for removal. Instead, he took advantage of conflicts between the Sauks and their white and Indian neighbors. The Sauks had trouble deciding how they wanted to deal with U.S. officials and settlers. Hostilities during the American Revolution had inspired anti-American feelings, but the Indians did not want to anger them if it would hurt their willingness to trade. Yet the Sauks also believed that the Americans unfairly favored the Osage Indians who lived just west of the Mississippi River. The Sauks and Osages had been enemies for years, and the Sauks did not want their rivals gaining an edge in the changing world. Sauk raiding soon led to problems with U.S. officials. In the early 1800s, the Sauks often traveled west of the Mississippi to hunt. Some of these expeditions included raids against the Osages. Attempts by federal officials to halt these attacks on the Osage villages only led to other difficulties. American settlements along the Mississippi River presented closer targets for Sauk warriors who were prevented from raiding the Osages. In 1804, a small Sauk raiding party attacked a white settlement on the Quever River north of St. Louis and killed 3 people. These deaths had immediate consequences. 2 Sauk leaders traveled to St. Louis to negotiate for peace. And while there they admitted that 4 of their young men had committed the murders. They offered to resolve the situation through traditional means. The Sauks would cover the dead by presenting gifts to the families of those who had been killed. But the settlers on Quever River would not accept those conditions, and federal officials demanded that the Sauks give up their young men. To maintain the peace, the Sauk Tribal Council Nally decided to send VE minor village chiefs to St. Louis. The chiefs Pashpaho, Quashquame, Auchequeka, Liavoy, and Hashequarikwa had the authority to negotiate with U.S. officials to avoid further violence. As a sign of good faith, they also brought with them one of the young men involved in the raid. When the Sauks arrived in St. Louis, the Americans placed the young man in prison. Because of this, the Sauk representatives viewed their mission in a new light, as both keeping the peace and gaining the release of the prisoner. They negotiated with Harrison, and the governor of Indiana Territory took advantage of the situation. He pushed the Sauk delegation to sign a treaty that made them give up some of their land. On November 3, the VE men put their marks on this treaty, which surrendered all of the Sauk lands east of the Mississippi River. According to the document, the Indians were the chiefs and head men of the United Sac and Fox tribes 5. In this agreement, therefore, the United States granted VE minor village chiefs authority over 2 different Indian tribes. The true story of this treaty remains somewhat mysterious. Harrison did not keep notes of the council, and the memories of the Sauk delegation were not very detailed. Pashpaho and his colleagues would later state that they did not know what they were signing. They also argued that Harrison kept them drunk during their stay in St. Louis. Until his death, Quashquame denied that he ever sold any land above the Rock River 6. At the very least, it appears that Harrison used the murders of the Quever River settlers to advance Jefferson's goals of land cessions. The United States now had claims to most of present-day Illinois and southern Wisconsin, and the Indians no longer owned the rights to their land. Although the 1804 treaty did not cause any immediate problems, it laid a foundation for significant conflict throughout the 3 decades that followed. The Sauks were angry with their delegates and confused about the actions of Harrison and the United States. Most Sauk headmen refused to recognize the validity of the treaty. However, since the agreement allowed the Sauks to remain on their lands until further notice, no major difficulties arose in 1804. The War of 1812. The violence that did come to the Mississippi Valley in the early 1810s was not a result of the 1804 treaty. The war that broke out between the United States and Great Britain spread across the eastern half of the continent and quickly involved Indian communities throughout the Great Lakes region. The onset of war divided many Indian villages, including those of the Sauks. While a substantial number of Sauks chose to stay neutral, a larger proportion chose to join the British in their GHT against the Americans. Both choices affected the future relations between the Sacs and the United States. Even before the War of 1812 began, Harrison and other U.S. officials were concerned about Sauk and Meskwaki intentions toward the United States. By early 1810, Tecumseh and the Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa had attracted thousands of followers to Prophetstown on the Tippecanoe River in Indiana. In the summer of 1810, federal officials believed that more than 1,000 Sacs and Meskwakis were considering joining this Indian confederacy aimed at resisting American expansion. Although parties of Sacs and Meskwakis visited Prophetstown, they never made a commitment to Tenskwatawa's cause. However, there was another reason for Americans to be concerned about Sauk and Meskwaki relations with the British. Although the Indians did not join the Shawnee prophet and Tecumseh, they did often travel to Fort Malden in 1810 and 1811 to obtain supplies from the British agents stationed there. The British gave their visitors food, clothing, guns, and ammunition, but told the Indians to stay at peace with the Americans. That advice would soon change. In the summer of 1812, the United States wanted to strengthen its relationship with the Western Indian nations so that they would remain at peace if any conflict arose with Great Britain. But even as a delegation of 27 Sauk, Meskwaki, and Osage Indians was on its way to Washington to meet with President James Madison, the United States declared war against Great Britain. During that Washington visit and the months that followed, U.S. officials preached neutrality. The British, led by the efforts of a trader named Robert Dixon, did everything they could to get the Sacs, Meskwakis, and their neighbors involved in the war. For Black Hawk and other Sacs, the decision to ally with the British was based in part on trade goods. Despite the promises made by President Madison and others in Washington, the American traders at Fort Madison would not supply the Indians with provisions on credit. Since the Sacs were used to receiving goods on credit in the fall and paying with the prots made from their hunts in the spring, this situation was unacceptable to them. According to messages from Dixon, the British traders were prepared to be more generous. In the wake of the Americans' unwillingness to follow through on their promises, Black Hawk became angry. "Here ended all hopes of our remaining at peace," he explained years later, having been forced into war by being deceived. 7. Although Black Hawk led parties of Sauk and Meskwaki men against the Americans throughout the western Great Lakes region, others chose to remain neutral. By the fall of 1813, about 1,500 Sauk, Meskwaki, Piankashaw, and Iowa Indians had established villages along the Missouri River, west of St. Louis. They had crossed the Mississippi River to escape the conflict and prove to the Americans that they wanted peace. The events of 1814 brought successes for the British and their Indian allies in i.e. Upper Mississippi Valley, but they also brought an end to the war. The Sacs and Meskwakis helped British forces defeat the Americans at a number of battles along the Mississippi River. Yet these Western victories did not alter the outcome of the overall conflict. In December 1814, American and British representatives signed the Treaty of Ghent and ended the War of 1812. The Sacs and Meskwakis found it hard to believe that the war was over. British agents had difficulty calling off war parties, and American commissioners found it hard to negotiate truces. Nearly 6 months after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, Black Hawk led a raid against Fort Howard that resulted in what is known as the Battle of the Sinkhole. Indeed, the negotiations between the hostile Sacs and U.S. officials did not nearly occur until May 1816. Conclusion: the peace that was concluded with the Sauk and Meskwaki Indians at the end of the War of 1812 was important for a number of reasons. The United States negotiated with two different factions: those who lived in the villages on the Missouri River and those who had remained east of the Mississippi and allied with the British. The Missouri Sacs and Meskwakis, who talked to U.S. commissioners at Portage de Sioux in 1815, signed two different treaties. Each treaty not only negotiated a truce but also confirmed the resolutions of the 1804 agreement. In their treaty, the Missouri Sacs also promised to remain separate from their relatives east of the Mississippi. The Sacs who nally sat down with U.S. officials in St. Louis in 1816 signed a similar treaty. But Black Hawk and the other men present did not believe that they had suffered a military defeat. They recognized that the British had ended the war, but did not believe that the Americans had defeated the Indians. And despite the apparent betrayal of the Treaty of Ghent, they continued relations with the British. Indeed, Americans would refer to Black Hawk's followers as the British Band from that point forward. 3. Diplomacy and conflict on the upper Mississippi River. By 1826, white settlers had begun streaming into the upper Mississippi Valley. They say that the white people's thirst after land is so great that they are never contented until they have a belly full of it, observed Thomas Forsyth, an Indian agent, or government official put in charge of Indian affairs. IHE Indians compare a white settlement in their neighborhood to a drop of raccoon's grease falling on a new blanket. The drop at RST is scarcely perceptible, but in time covers almost the whole blanket. At the end of the War of 1812, the Sacs and Meskwakes had not only agreed to a truce but they had also reconfirmed the resolutions of the 1804 treaty. By the mid-1820s, they were under tremendous pressure from white settlers who wanted the lands of Illinois, as well as the lead mines on the eastern banks of the Mississippi River. For the Sacs and Meskwakes, however, the situation was further complicated by their relationships with neighboring Indian tribes. The declining wild game populations east of the Mississippi forced Sac and Meskwake hunters. 34. Diplomacy 81 Connacht on the upper Mississippi River 35 to venture farther west in search of their prey. These expeditions during the winter and summer months often led to conflicts with the Dakota Sioux bands who hunted in the same territories. Peace between these native communities was also hindered by the ambitions of young men who wanted to earn recognition as respected warriors in the tribe. In the 1820s, then, the Sacs and Meskwakes had to concern themselves with diplomacy. The encroachment of American settlements may have created the biggest problems, especially since the white settlers knew that the 1804 treaty had granted the land to the United States. However, Sac and Meskwake leaders also had to deal with their Indian neighbors, even as they tried to maintain control over their younger men who wanted to prove themselves in combat. And the actions of the U.S. government had an impact on all of these relationships. U.S. officials consistently tried to maintain peaceful relations among all of the parties in the region. These attempts to hold off the violence may have led to temporary truces, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. Inter-Indian relations from 1816 forward, the United States tried to keep the peace among the various Indian tribes in the upper Mississippi Valley. To promote and protect white settlement on both sides of the Mississippi River, U.S. officials wanted to make sure that the Indians did not engage in intertribal warfare. Yet these attempts to avoid violence were seldom successful. More often than not, U.S. officials kept their own goals in mind and neglected the perspectives, desires, and traditions of the Indians. Into the mid-1820s, the Sacs and Meskwakes often found themselves more frustrated than pleased with U.S. involvement. Throughout the early 19th century, Sac and Meskwake Indians engaged in sporadic warfare with Indians living along the Missouri River. These hostilities intensified in the 1810s as the Sacs and Meskwakes sought to establish greater control over hunting territories south and west of the Missouri River. Wild game populations east of the Mississippi had been steadily decreasing. Consequently, the Sacs and Meskwakes made a concerted effort to push the Osages, Otos, Omahas, and other Missouri River tribes from their western hunting lands. This activity also led to violence with 37. The Wahpeton and Sisseton bands of Dakota Sioux who hunted along the Des Moines River in present-day Iowa. Government solutions to these conflicts almost always involved treaties, and this particular situation was no different. After numerous attempts to broker a peace through smaller sessions, two government officials, William Clark and Lewis Cass, called for a larger meeting. In August 1825, Clark and Cass arrived at Prairie du Chien to hold a council with nearly 2,000 Indians. Among the assembled Indians were representatives from the Sauk, Meskwaki, Menominee, Iowa, Dakota Sioux, Ho-Chunk, and the United Band of Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. Members of these tribes lived and hunted throughout the upper Mississippi Valley, and they needed to resolve disputes over contested land claims, boundary lines, and hunting territories. The 1825 Treaty Council at Prairie du Chien was the largest gathering of Indians in the upper Mississippi Valley up to that time. Lodges of men, women, and children spread along the banks of the river for miles north and south of the settlement. The Sauks, Meskwakis, and Iowas were the last to arrive in early August, and they made a grand entrance. The men had decorated themselves as if for battle and used their arrival to demonstrate their strength and fearlessness of their enemies, particularly the Dakota Sioux. During the course of 2 days, the assembled delegates narrowly reached a compromise on the boundaries in question. Although the null agreement appeared to put the intertribal problems to rest, the I-825 Treaty of Prairie du Chien did not end the conflicts. Less than 20 years later, the Sauks and Meskwakis registered a series of complaints with /7 Iliam Clark. A Sauk headman named Keokuk reported that hunting parties of the Dakota Sioux bands consistently ignored boundary lines established by the treaty resolutions. //Apello, a Meskwaki headman, made a similar criticism. Since that time we have been much troubled about land we thought ours, he protested. We thought the Sioux would not be allowed to hunt on our lands. The Sioux do not observe the treaties they make, they violate them. Once government agents realized that the Treaty of Prairie du Chien had failed to end the intertribal conflict, they called for yet another council. In 1830, the Indians of the upper Mississippi met again with the intention of narrowly establishing peace according to the federal government's wishes. 3 distinct issues undermined the Treaty of Prairie du Chien and threatened to weaken any further agreements. First, the boundary lines established by such treaties were never clear to everyone involved. Indeed, Clark believed. Diplomacy 81 Conflict on the upper Mississippi River 39 that the continuing violence between the Dakota Sioux and the Sauks was a result of this misunderstanding. A second problem was more complicated and was best explained by the impact of the boundaries on the deer populations in the region. By establishing peace and separating hunting territories, the Treaty of Prairie du Chien eliminated the buffer zones between tribes that allowed the deer a relatively safe habitat. Under the new treaty, hunters could initially pursue the deer without fearing rival hunting parties. This led to overhunting and soon forced Indians to range beyond the established treaty boundaries. In other words, the solutions presented by the treaty only created more problems. It is no surprise, then, that intertribal violence in the late 1820s often began between hunting parties. The continuous pressure applied by outsider settlement in the region created the third and null problem. As the number of Anglo-American settlers increased on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, the Sauks and Meskwakis were pushed to the western banks. To provide for their families, Indian hunters were forced to range farther from their villages and into contested territories. However, this was only one issue presented by the rising numbers of American settlers. American settlement and the lead mines Illinois entered the Union as the 20th state in 1818. LN 1820, it had a population of just more than 55,000, and in 1830 that population had risen to about 157,000. The explanations for this rapid population increase in the region vary. Part of the responsibility rested in federal policy. The end of the /var of 1812 created a rush to settle the Great Lakes region, as many Americans established homesteads in the southern part of Illinois. But the U.S. government also promoted settlement in the region through its policy toward veterans of the war. Soldiers who had fought in the U.S. Army were given land grants of 320 acres each. They could then choose the location for their grant in sections set aside for that purpose within Arkansas, Missouri, or Illinois. The area open to white settlement in Illinois was located between the Illinois and Mississippi rivers. The arrival of new settlers in the southern and central portion of Illinois did not immediately affect the Sauks and Meskwakis. Their villages, elds, and livelihood were threatened more by those men who worked to the northwestern part of the state to mine lead. The presence of lead in the area had never been a secret, and the Indians had profited from this resource for decades. But the rising demand for the element in the early 19th century made it increasingly valuable to the people of the United States. Thousands of Americans visited the region between the Wisconsin and Rock Rivers in the mid to late 1820s. Indians had mined the lead deposits of the upper Mississippi Valley for thousands of years and used their product as a trade good well before the arrival of Europeans. Indeed, archaeologists in Alabama, Georgia, and Ontario have even unearthed beads, buttons, and pendants fashioned with lead from those mines. When the RST Frenchmen oted down the Mississippi in the 17th century, they learned of the lead deposits and taught the local Indian populations how to smelt the ore and form it into new tools and objects. Over time this mineral resource became an important part of the Sauk and Meskwaki economy. The presence of the French altered the importance of these lead mines among the Sauks and Meskwakis. First and foremost, the lead ore became an integral economic resource. Although Sauk and Meskwaki men continued to hunt to obtain food and furs, their trade relationship with the French in the 18th century included a substantial exchange in lead as well. Second, the trade with the French, and later the English, brought guns to the Indians. The presence of the lead mines and the ability to melt the ore made it easier for Sauks and Meskwakis to produce the ammunition for this welcome new technology. The work necessary to produce the lead for trade tied in well with the traditional gender roles in Sauk and Meskwaki villages. By and large, the native women were the ones who mined the lead ore. Just as they managed the cornfields and the production of sugar, Sauk and Meskwaki women played the most important role in the production of lead. // dug the ore from the ground, carried it to the furnaces, and smelted it. And as the demand for lead grew during the course of the 18th century, the women's labor became more prolonged and intensive. They produced lead for Indian and European consumers alike. Every fall and spring hunters would go down to the mines and get a stock of bullets, a Ho-Chunk man recalled, sometimes giving goods for it and sometimes furs 1 degree. Although a number of Europeans played a part in the native production of lead, Julien Dubuque may have had the most significant impact. Dubuque was the youngest child of a well-known French-Canadian family and had moved to Prairie du Chien in 1783. He married Ayazit Antea, a woman of French and Meskwaki descent. This marriage helped him establish the necessary kinship ties with the local Meskwaki community and aided his career as a trader. Perhaps most important, in 1788, the Meskwakis granted Dubuque temporary rights to a section of land on the western side of the Mississippi River that included lead mines. The Meskwaki headman told the Frenchman that he could work that land for as long as he should live. Dubuque lived until 1810, and during his 22 years on the Meskwaki land grant, he established a strong relationship with the local Indian populations. He not only traded in lead, but also engaged in a healthy exchange of furs and agricultural produce. Dubuque's Mines of Spain, as he called his estate, was a center of economic and social activity in the region. It appears, however, that he actually bought more lead from local Indian women than he mined on his own property. He used his relationship with the Meskwakis to become the most prominent trader in native mined lead in the upper Mississippi Valley. From 1788 to 1810, Sauk and Meskwaki women in the vicinity performed far more labor related to lead than they had in previous decades. The mines of Spain became the subject of great controversy after the trader's death. Although the Meskwakis insisted that Dubuque's land grant was temporary, others disagreed. Years before, to raise money for trade goods, Dubuque had sold the rights to a portion of his land to the St. Louis trader Auguste Choteau. After Dubuque's death, Choteau believed that he was the rightful owner of that section of the property. Yet the Meskwakis declared to U.S. officials that they never would consent to their land being sold. Now there were two underlying disputes over the land in the region. The Meskwakis resisted the Choteau claim, and both the Sauks and Meskwakis continued to contest the validity of the cessions from 1804. Despite these issues, there were not any significant connects with the United States until the early 1820s, when Americans began to demand access to the lead region on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. Since the territory in question had been officially ceded in the 1804 treaty, the Americans believed that they should be allowed on those lands. Over the protests of the Sauks, Meskwakes, and Ho-Chunks, or /Vinnebagos, whose villages were endangered by these demands, the U.S. government began to grant leases to miners. The RST stage of the rush began in the summer of 1822, as several hundred miners set up camps along the Fever River in what is today northwestern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. Thomas Forsyth, the Indian agent at the Rock River Agency in 1822, advised the Meskwakes to relocate all of 43 their mining activities to the western side of the Mississippi River. He believed that this would be the best way to avoid conflict with the oncoming American miners. Meskwake leaders hoped to compromise and offered to lease their lands for a period of 4 years. Forsyth and the United States refused this offer, and instead told the Indians that any physical resistance would result in U.S. military intervention. From 1822 to 1828, in what is today northwestern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, tensions began to rise. The lead mining district, the center of all the activity during those years, lay south of the Wisconsin River and north of the Rock River. The non-Indian population of that region was only about 200 in 1825, but it had risen to more than 4,000 by 1827. Nearly all of these miners were young white men, eager to earn their fortune and ready to take on anyone who stood in their way. The needs and desires of the miners clashed with those of the Sauks, Meskwakes, and Ho-Chunks. Miners often trespassed on Indian lands, and native headmen did what they could to expel the intruders without igniting a conflict. Local Indian agents also received complaints of harassment, particularly involving male miners and native women. The situation was tense, but substantial trouble was often avoided. Although there was little violence between Indians and miners from 1822 to 1826, that situation soon changed. On Iyun 24, 1827, members of the Prairie La Crosse band of Ho-Chunks attacked the home of the Gagnier family, north of Prairie du Chien. The Indians were retaliating, in part, for the continued intrusions of American miners on their lands. This Winnebago revolt, as it is known, was short-lived. The next Endnell incident involved an assault on 2 small boats carrying American miners. In the end, few Indians in the region joined in the uprising, and a quick show of force by the U.S. Army convinced any doubters that resistance would not be wise. Yet the Ho-Chunk attacks revealed the anger of the native residents of the lead mining district. They were upset with the continued invasion of the miners, and they could not believe that the U.S. government would not take action. Karumna, a Ho-Chunk chief, told Joseph Street that the Indians had not expected this invasion. "The hills are covered with them," the headman informed the Indian agent. "More are coming, and shoving us off our lands to make lead. We want our father to stop this before blood may be shed by bad men." NS on Ho-Chunk land in November 1827, Joseph M. Street assumed his new position at the head of the Winnebago Indian Agency at Prairie du Chien. At this time, tensions were rising because of the encroachment of American settlers on Ho-Chunk, or Winnebago, lands in the lead mining region. The following excerpts come from a letter that Street wrote to Governor Ninian Edwards of Illinois. The Indians had been soured by the conduct of the vast number of adventurers ocking to and working the lead mines of Fever River. Those who went by land, by far the greater part, passed through the Winnebago country. Many of them had great contempt for naked Indians, and behaved low, gross, and like blackguards amongst them. The agent at the mines granted permits on the Winnebago lands, and numerous diggings were industriously pushed far east of the line between the Ottawas, Chippewas, and Potawatomis of the Illinois, and the Winnebagos, and great quantitia of mineral procured and taken away to the smelters. I should have called your attention to your treaty of the August 24, 1816, and the treaty of August 19, 1825, which together establish diplomacy. 8. Connacht on the upper Mississippi River. 45 Karumna's words fell on deaf ears. By the late 1820s, the protests of Ho-Chunk, Sauk, and Meskwaka leaders would not be able to halt the encroachments of American settlers in the region. Lust as important, those protests would fail to persuade government officials that something needed to be done about it. Ioseph Street, Thomas Forsyth, William Clark, and other federal agents in the region believed that the time had come for the Indians to leave their lands on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. These men appeared more than willing to enforce the terms of the 1804 treaty. The line between the Ottawas, etc., and the Winnebagos. From this you perceive that you in the Treaty of August 24, 1816 made the only reservations that have been made, and they are all west of the line of the Winnebagos. Then we have no color of claim on the Winnebago lands whatever. Harrison indeed bought all this land by the Treaty of 3 November, 1804, from a point 36 miles up the Wisconsin to Lake Saucahegon, at the head of Fox River of the Illinois. This includes the whole mining district, 80 or 100 miles east of the mouth of Fever River. But in the Treaty of August 19, 1825, the commissioners recognize and establish the right of Winnebagos to this land, and make no exception or reservation except at P2ch. This closes all our chance of claim. His is the treaty you said you had never noticed, and that you would have opposed its ratification had you considered its provisions. The Winnebagam complained of the trespass of the miners, and the open violation of the treaty by the permits of Mr. Thomas, the AGT. No notice was taken and the diggings progressed. The Indians attempted force which was repelled, and very angry feelings produced conclusion the Sauk and Meskwaka were only two of the many Indian nations inhabiting the upper Mississippi Valley in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Villages housing thousands of men, women, and children rested along the banks of the rivers throughout the region. The hunting practices of these native populations, as well as the ambitions of young men within each tribe, often made it difficult to maintain the peace. And in the two decades of the 19th century, the situation became even more complicated with the arrival of thousands of American settlers who sought land and the resources that the land contained. It was a potentially volatile mix if not managed well. In the 1820s, the U.S. government and its agents illustrated that it either could not or would not handle the challenge presented by the populations in that region. American attempts to mediate peaceful relations among the Indians were ultimately unsuccessful, in part because federal officials did not appear to understand the problem. The efforts to maintain peace between the miners and the Indians failed for another reason entirely. As demonstrated by the leases given to miners and the advice given to Indians, U.S. officials in the late 1820s had made two critical decisions. They would allow miners access to the lead, and either encourage or force the Indians to move west of the Mississippi River. 4. Sauk leadership. Fragments. In the late 18,205, leadership or TM1 Sauk Indians was disjoined. We were a divided people, Black Hawk noted, forming two parties. Keokuk being at the head of one, willing to barter our rights merely for the good opinion of the whites, and cowardly enough to desert our village to them. Was at the head of the other party, and was determined to hold on to my village, although I had been ordered to leave it. 3. His description the general understanding of most U.S. officials at the time. As far as the federal government was concerned, Keokuk was the headman who had the realistic and proper view of the situation. He agreed that it was useless and wrong to resist, and that it would be best for the Sauks if they negotiated with the Americans and moved west of the Mississippi River. Black Hawk, on the other hand, was viewed as the troublemaker. He was the man who refused to listen to the reasoning of the government and refused to surrender the tribe's ancestral village of Saukenuk. Although Keokuk and Black Hawk are two of the most influential and prominent Sauk Indians of that era, their story and their differences are not so clear-cut. Both men rose to positions of leadership outside of the traditional channels. In some respects, they should not have been the headmen of the two sides within their nation. Yet the circumstances of the time created the opportunity for each man to exert a tremendous amount of influence. From 1828 to 1831, the Sacs confronted a U.S. government intent on relocating them west of the Mississippi River. The members of the Sac Nation had two different paths they could follow, that of Keokuk, or that of Black Hawk. Keokuk preached peace, negotiation, and relocation. Black Hawk argued that the Sacs could not and should not abandon Sakanuck in the face of American pressure and deceit. Neither position was necessarily better than the other, however. These differing stances meant that by the summer of 1831, the Mississippi River divided the settlements of the Sacs and Meskwakes. Traditions of Sac leadership among the Sac Indians was structured by a variety of societal divisions and traditions. A tribal council, which included representatives from each of the 12 clans, oversaw affairs for the entire nation. The council did not have the authority to impose its will on its people and relied to a great extent on persuasion and social pressure. Strong headmen had to have the respect of their people to maintain a position of influence. In addition to this more formal structure, the Sacs also had more localized leaders in their villages. However, the most influential men of the different settlements were not necessarily the men who sat in the tribal council. Positions of leadership were hereditary through the clans. The Trout and Sturgeon clans provided the civil chiefs, while the Fox clan provided the war chiefs. Yet this was not the only level of social organization. At birth, Sac boys were placed in one of two groups within the tribe, the Kishko and the Sac leadership fragments. Oshkosh. The RST male child followed his father's lineage, and the second son became a member of the other division. In part, these two social divisions organized the Sac tribe for internal competitions, where the Kishko would cover themselves in white clay and the Oshkosh in black charcoal. This in turn trained the young men for the future roles in their community. The Sac Tribal Council was in charge of treaty negotiations and other meetings with Indian delegations and U.S. officials. Although this council oversaw most social and political matters, it did not direct all tribal affairs. When it came to raids on other Indian tribes and decisions to go to war, the tribal council had less control. Such decisions were left to the Sac men who had earned reputations as successful leaders. Indeed, any individual could raise a war party under the right circumstances. Because of the events of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, successful war leaders gained more influence within Sac society. Those decades witnessed a significant amount of violence both between Indian tribes themselves and between Indians and U.S. citizens. The Indian men who showed bravery during those times and led their people to victories earned respect and influence beyond their station. The tribal council did not disappear during those years, but the most authoritative voices within the councils had changed. The Sacs experienced this transition just as strong leadership had become so crucial. In the three decades of the 19th century, and especially in the 1820s, the relationship with the U.S. government depended on the abilities of Sac headmen to negotiate with federal officials. It was not just a question of who the Sacs wanted to represent them, but with whom the U.S. officials would negotiate in council. This circumstance made the differences between Black Hawk and Keokuk even more apparent and important. At the time of this early 18,305 oil painting by George Catlin, Black Hawk, or Makatame Shakiakiak, would have been in his mid-60s. Although he never rose to the status of chief, Black Hawk was a prominent warrior who gained notoriety because he refused to abandon traditional Sac ways. Malkatame Shakiakiak, or Black Hawk, was not a principal chief of the Sacs. He was 63 years old in 1830 and one of the elders of his people. His voice was heard in councils and U.S. officials knew his name, but he had earned a position. Sac leadership fragments among the leading men as a warrior, not as a diplomat or a civil chief. Black Hawk's notable exploit as a warrior came at the age of 15, when he killed an enemy in battle for the time. He and his father, Paisa, had joined a Sac war party against the Osage, and the young Black Hawk took the scalp of an Osage warrior. Upon his return to Sakanuke, Black Hawk participated in a scalp dance for the RST time and began his rise to glory. He led a successful raid several months later and gained further acclaim. Before he had reached the end of his second decade, he had already led 200 men against the Osage settlements west of the Mississippi River. In his early 20s, Black Hawk lost his father and inherited an important emblem of the Sacs. Paisa died in a battle against the Cherokees and his son could not save his father's life. El now fell heir to the great medicine bag of my forefathers, which had belonged to my father, Black Hawk reported. The young man viewed this bag with reverence and a sense of duty. Within this bundle made of either animal skin or birch bark, Black Hawk held amulets that were both the keys to military success and, in his words, the soul of the Sac nation. He did not bear this burden lightly. Although his lineage and possession of this medicine bag granted Black Hawk substantial respect within the Sac community, it was his continued martial exploits that earned him a place at their councils. He continued to lead war parties against their enemies and actively supported the British against the Americans in the War of 1812. At the war's end, he reluctantly signed a peace treaty that confirmed the resolutions of the 1804 Accord. The treaty he signed in 1816 is important for another reason. The leaders and prominent men of the Sacs at Rock River signed this treaty, and Black Hawk's name was only 8th on the list. He was nearly 50 years old and a reputable warrior, but he was not the leader of the Sacs at Rock 52 River. Similarly, when 10 Sac and Meskwaka chiefs traveled to Washington, D.C., in 1824 to negotiate a peace with the Dakota Sioux, Black Hawk did not go. His authority did not extend past leadership on raids. Nevertheless, by the late 1820s, Black Hawk had become a prominent voice because he refused to give up traditional ways. He had spent his life as a warrior, leading Sac men against their enemies. Despite the outcome of the War of 1812, he continued to travel to Canada to trade and talk with the British. He had lived for more than 60 years according to the principles of Sac society and traditions, and expected to continue his medicine bag throughout his autobiography. Black Hawk talks about the medicine bag of the Sacs that he inherited from his father. He carried this bag throughout his life and viewed it with great reverence. In the excerpt below, a Sac Indian named Wenabinamoata describes the importance of the medicine bag to the Sacs. "You know," said he, "that we always carry medicine bags about us, and that in these we place the highest condence, that we take them when we go to war, that we administer of their contents to our relations when sick." 8 RC. The great veneration in which we hold them, arises from our deeming them indispensable to obtain success against our enemies. They have been transmitted to us by our forefathers, who received them at the hands of the great master of life himself. We never venture upon a warlike undertaking unless, by their means, our chiefs should have previously had visions, advising them road so. When we are near to our enemies, they impart to us the faculty of beholding, in the heavens, great rests passing from one cloud to another. If these rests be numerous, long continued, and extensive, it is a sure sign to seasonal rounds despite the pressures of the world around him. Most important, he believed that the Sacs and Meskwakis had been deceived several times over and that they had never surrendered their homelands to the Americans. Keokuk and the politics of accommodation. Keokuk became the foil to Black Hawk in many respects. He was younger than Black Hawk by a little more than a decade, born into the Fox clan and therefore a warrior by birth. Unlike Black Hawk, however, Keokuk gained a position of Indians because of the battles he did not he preferred peaceful negotiation to bloodshed. U.S. officials respected his eloquence and granted him power because he was willing to negotiate. And while Black Hawk assumed a stance in direct opposition to the Americans, Keokuk worked with the U.S. government to keep his people safe from harm. However, Keokuk had not always favored capitulation. He rose to prominence during the War of 1812, when his eloquence and courage earned him a position in the tribal council. In October 1813, the residents of Sahkanook received word that an American force was headed in their direction. With many of their warriors absent, the Sauk leadership decided to temporarily relocate across the river. Keokuk was 33 years old and not allowed to be present at the council. Yet when he heard of the decision, he asked permission to speak. He criticized the principal men for their cowardice and declared that he would stand and GHT. The Sauk Council took courage from his stance and gave him their support. Although the American attack did not materialize, Keokuk had now earned a new position as war chief for Sahkanook. The next significant transition in his left hand. There is no Indian chief on the frontier better known at this time, or more highly appreciated for his eloquence, as a public speaker, than Keokuk, as he has repeatedly visited Washington and others afar Atlantic towns, and made his speeches before thousands, when he has been contending for his people's rights, in their stipulations with the United States government, for the sale of their lands. Mukatamisho Kakaik is the man to whom I have above alluded, as the leader of the Black Hawk War, who was defeated by General Atkinson, and held prisoner of war, and sent through Washington and other eastern cities, with a number of others, to be gazed at. This man, whose name has carried a sort of terror through the country where it has been sounded, has been distinguished as Aspiaker or Count Sella rather than as a warrior, and I believe it has been pretty generally admitted, that Na Pope and the Prophet were, in fact, the instigators of war, and either often with much higher claims for the name of warrior than Black Hawk ever had. When I painted this chief, he was dressed in a plain suit of buckskin, with strings of wampum in his ears and on his neck, and held in his hand, his medicine bag, which was the skin of a black hawk, from which he had taken his name, and the tail of which made him a fan, which he was almost constantly using. Balconies, and bows to the multitudes with unexceptionable grace. 2. Yet even Black Hawk grew tired of the continued attention. He was happy when the tournale reached an end in early Iuli 1833, and he was allowed to rejoin his family in a settlement on the Lau River. In the end, the tour served the purpose envisioned by Cass. The numbers of Americans who populated the eastern cities was at times overwhelming to the Indian captives. During the course of their journey, they were equally amazed by things such as railroads, hot air balloons, and the overall kindness of the white men and women who welcomed them at each place they visited. The end of the journey also brought sorrow, however, as Black Hawk viewed the increased settlements on the western side of the Mississippi River. "I am very much afraid," he stated, "that in a few years, they will begin to drive and abuse our people, as they have formerly done. I may not live to see it, but I feel certain that the day is not distant." The Sauks and Meskwakes in Iowa in the 18,405 indeed, the drive of which the elderly Sauk had spoken began within a month of his surrender. While Black Hawk was still imprisoned at Efferson Barracks and before he toured the eastern United States in his dual role as a prisoner of war and a celebrity, the headmen of the Sauk and Meskwake villages west of the Mississippi sit down in council with General Wynald Scott and Governor Ione Reynolds. Scott and Reynolds had been appointed as treaty commissioners and they were charged with two assignments. First, they demanded payment from the Sauks and Meskwakes for the expenditures made by the United States during the recent conflict. Their second mission was to arrange for further land cessions from the Sauks and Meskwakes. Having concluded that the cause of the war was the closeness of the Indians to the white population, federal officials deemed it necessary for the Sauks and Meskwakes to cede all of their territory along the Mississippi River. This would put more distance between the Indians and the citizens of Illinois and would theoretically decrease the possibility of further problems. Keokuk, Wapello, and other Sauk and Meskwake headmen sat in council with Scott and Reynolds from September 19 to September 21, 1832. During that time, they considered the government's offer of $600,000 paid out over 30 years for about 6 million acres located on the western side of the Mississippi River. Keokuk was the most vocal headman during the course of the negotiations. He knew that Scott and Reynolds were essentially dictating the terms of this accord. but he also recognized that the federal government wanted him to be the principal chief of the Sauk and Meskwaki. US Oisials believed they could bypass Sauk and Meskwaki traditions and make Keokuk the sole leader of the remaining villages. Keokuk welcomed this idea, and took the opportunity to present a list of requests on the second day of the council. "The remainder of our lands is small," he noted toward the end of his speech. "The Sioux and others have been in the habit of hunting our lands. We wish you to guard us from their intrusions, and let us enjoy our land in peace." Keokuk spoke for all of the Sauks and Meskwakis when he asked that they be allowed to enjoy their land in peace. Yet his statement did not refer only to the dangers presented by the hunting parties of the Dakota Sioux. It also applied to the very real possibility that the U.S. government and its citizens would demand more territory in the future. "I made similar pushes to remove the Indian populations from those states. In Indiana, federal and state officials focused their efforts on the Potawatomi and Miami settlements located north of and along the Wabash River. From 1832 to 1836, federal treaty commissioners signed nearly 20 different land cession treaties with Potawatomi bands living throughout the northern third of the state. The dispersed Potawatomi villages wreaked the localized nature of political authority within the larger community. In other words, federal agents could not sign one treaty to arrange for the removal of all the Potawatomis from the region. During the course of the 1830s, therefore, small bands of Potawatomis relocated to present-day eastern Kansas in stages. The removal of the Yellow River Band of Potawatomi was one of the most infamous of these forced relocations. It occurred at the same time as the Cherokee removal in the southeast and is known as the Trail of Death. The Yellow River Potawatomis refused to recognize the validity of a treaty ceding their remaining lands in Indiana. As a result, they grew upset when white settlers began to cultivate the land near their villages. Isolated outbreaks of violence between settlers and Indians led Indiana's governor to call out the militia, and in September 1838, those militiamen rounded up nearly 800 Potawatomis. During the course of 2 months, the Indiana soldiers marched this band west. The Potawatomis buried nearly 420 men, women, and children on that journey. The Miami Indians living on the Wabash River and its tributaries in northern Indiana experienced the same pressures faced by their Potawatomi neighbors. Treaty commissioners arrived hand in hand with the ever-increasing non-Indian population, and through the federal government's persistent efforts the Miami land holdings of almost 4 million acres in the early 1830s dropped to about 30,000 acres by the end of the decade. Then in 1840, Chief I.E.N.B. Richardville signed an agreement stating that the Miamis would leave Indiana for new homes in the West within VE years. Because of repeated efforts by the Miamis to delay this relocation, the federal government now took action. In early October 184-6, U.S. soldiers used the threat of force to gather as many of the Miamis as they could, and forced them to board several canal boats in Peru, Indiana. After a journey of 27 days, during which about 6 Miamis died of sickness, 328 emigrants disembarked at present-day Kansas City via the steamboat Clermont II. On November 9, they arrived at their reservation after traveling 50 miles inland. The interconnected stories of treaties and removals repeated themselves throughout the western Great Lakes region in the 1830s and I-84OS. The Ho-Chunk ceded their entire land southeast of the Wisconsin River in an I-832 treaty, and VE years later agreed to remove to an assigned territory west of the Mississippi River. Although the relocation of the Ho-Chunks did not go exactly as planned by the treaty commissioners, by the late 184OS, the Ho-Chunk villages were largely relocated west of the Mississippi River. 100. Wisconsin entered the Union in 1848, and its white citizens did not include Indians in their visions for the future of the state. Conclusion: the months and years after the end of the Black Hawk War revealed an interesting aspect of the relationship between the citizens of the United States and American Indians. Black Hawk, whose name had struck fear in the hearts of Illinois settlers in the summer of 1832, became a celebrity throughout the eastern cities in the spring and summer of 1833. He was all at once an oddity, an exotic individual, and a living Indian warrior at whom crowds of American citizens could gawk and admire from a safe and comfortable distance. In the latter stages of his journey, however, the crowds were not as friendly, and in Detroit a mob even burned Black Hawk in effigy. American settlers in the western Great Lakes did not share the same romantic image of Black Hawk that had been crafted by their eastern counterparts. Instead they saw the elderly Sauk warrior as a prime example of the dangers posed by Indians on the frontier and the validity of western relocation. Therefore, the Black Hawk //AR was a catalyst and an example, a spark that furthered Indian removal in the region, and an illustration of why that removal was deemed necessary. 8. Icons and Indians in the United States. On a bluff overlooking the eastern bank or the Rock River at Loudoun State Park in Oregon, Illinois, stands a sculpture that is nearly 50 feet tall and weighs at least 100 tons. The statue is that of an Indian man standing with his arms folded over his chest and looking out over the river. LT's creator, Lorado Taft, sculpted the monument in 1911 and named it the Eternal Indian. Taft allegedly told his colleagues that the very stance of the statue made him think of Indians who had such a deep love for the environment and who must have often gazed upon the same landscape in days gone by. Despite the universal name Taft gave his creation, this statue has become associated with Black Hawk. And to residents of the region, the sculpture is said to suggest a spirit unconquered while still a conquered race. 6. Only 200 miles west of the statue is the Meskwaki Indian settlement, located just west of Tama, Iowa. On this settlement of about 3,200 acres live more than 1,000 Meskwaki Indians. Their ancestors had returned to Iowa in the 1850s after losing their land in Kansas. They purchased an 80-acre. In 1911, artist Lorado Taft created the Eternal Indian, which many people believe represents Black Hawk. The statue, which stands nearly 50 feet tall, is located in Loudoun State Park in Oregon, Illinois. Plot of land and gradually built up their community and acreage in the century and a half that followed. Although the strength of their traditional values has grounded their survival throughout the years, the Meskwakis have also taken advantage of opportunities to bolster the tribal economy. In late July 2006, they unveiled a new $110 million extension to their already successful hotel and casino operation. Laowa visitors and residents are able to play everything from bingo to poker, and the Meskwaki Nation and its members are benefiting financially from its operation. The statue on the Rock River and the Meskwaki settlement in Tama provide a glimpse into a prominent issue faced by American Indians in the present day. It is a battle between the iconic Indian of the 19th century and the reality of the 20th century. The Eternal Indian is only one example of this larger struggle, as many non-Indians stubbornly hold on to the created images of men like Black Hawk and allow little room for the Indian men and women of today. The federally recognized tribes and nations of Sauks and Meskwakis have lived and continue to live with the consequences of the War of 1832 and the treaties that followed. Most reside far from the lands Black Hawk and others tried to retain, and they work hard to provide for the future of their people. It has not been easy, and the battle has been complicated throughout the past 2 centuries by those who refuse to give up a constructed or stereotypical image of American Indians, especially that of Black Hawk. Black Hawk's body. The creation and recreation of Black Hawk as an icon started in the last years of his life and continued with the theft of his body shortly after his death. Black Hawk lived 4 years after completing his journey through the cities of the eastern United States. Most of those years were spent with his wife, 2 sons, and a daughter in a home along the Iowa River. Yet even as he tried to adjust to his new life west of the Mississippi, the elderly Sauk became a cult hero throughout the region. Visitors often arrived on his doorstep with gifts, and all of them hoped to meet and talk to the famous chief. 103. 104. Was safe to treat Black Hawk as a historical curiosity because there was no longer any reason to fear him. A historian in the early 20th century wrote that Black Hawk's post-war experiences created a misleading image of the Indian and the history of the conflict. Those last few years, Frank Stevens asserted, have been thus carelessly permitted to become the monument to the man, and those who drove him from power have been harshly judged. 7. Indeed, it did appear that residents of Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin were willing to overlook the past and viewed the former Sauk leader as either a hero or a martyr. Black Hawk was even the guest of honor at a 4th of Iuli celebration at Fort Madison, overlooking the Mississippi River. Those present toasted their famous guest, hoping that his days be as calm and serene as his previous life has been boisterous and full of warlike incidents. Despite his continued celebrity status, Black Hawk had little if any authority among his people in the last years of his life, and he continued to blame Keokuk for his condition. He died on October 3, 1838, at the age of 71, and was buried above ground in the traditional manner. His family placed him on a wooden board, one end of which was placed in the ground. Black Hawk wore a number of medals around his neck, and he had 3 days' worth of food and a pair of moccasins for his journey to the next world. 3 other poles then provided supports for a mound built over the body with sod. The burial structure was designed in part to prevent animals from ending the body. But it could not prevent the assaults of humans. In the summer of I-839, a man from Lexington, Iowa, named Dr. Iams Turner raided the grave and stole Black Hawk's remains. // hen noted by Black Hawk's family of the desecration, the governor of Iowa Territory led a passionate search for the culprit and the bones. Although the remains were recovered, they were not reburied. Instead they were given to the Geological and Historical Society Museum in Burlington, Iowa. The renowned Sauk leader would thus become an attraction in death as he had been in the latter years of his life. Then, when that building burned down in 1855, Black Hawk's remains were turned into ash along with the entire structure. Black Hawk's autobiography, The Construction of the Iconic Black Hawk, was not solely the work of outsiders. Before he died, Black Hawk displayed a personal interest in shaping the American public's perception of him and his people. From August to October 1833, Black Hawk dictated the events of his life to Antoine Leclerc, who was at the time employed by the U.S. government as an interpreter for the Sauks and Meskwakes. According to Leclerc, the elderly Sauk showed an interest in recording his life story after his return from the tour of the eastern United States. Black Hawk told his story to Leclerc, who translated it into English. A newspaper editor named Ione B. Patterson then prepared the resulting narrative for publication. It was the R.S.T. Indian autobiography published in the United States, and it continues to be an important resource for the historical period. In the book's dedication, Black Hawk made clear his reasons for telling his side of the story. He addressed it to Brigadier General Henry Atkinson, the man who was responsible for the null defeat of the British band more than a year before. Before I set out on my journey to the land of my fathers, Black Hawk declared, I have determined to give my motives and reasons for my former hostilities to the whites, and to vindicate my character from misrepresentation. 9. Having just returned from the tour of the eastern cities, Black Hawk knew that Americans were very interested in hearing his story. It is also apparent that he believed that his actions had never been understood clearly by the citizens of 106. The United States. Specifically, he wanted Americans to know that he had always wanted peace and had been forced into war. His autobiography would therefore correct and counteract the false stories he may have heard during his time as a captive celebrity. There has been a host of debates throughout the years about the authenticity of Black Hawk's autobiography. In 1835, an article in the North American Review stated about the work, "It is almost the only one we have ever read, in which we feel perfect confidence, that the author sincerely believes that everything he has set down is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." 5 degree. 2 decades later, an Illinois historian argued that Black Hawk knew little about the book and that it was merely a work of fiction created by Leclerc and Patterson. It is true that the work as published in 1833 is a story told through 2 different interpreters. Although it is impossible to know what may have been lost or added in the transfer of material from Black Hawk to Patterson, the accuracy and the insights provided in the autobiography appear to support its authenticity. Neither those who have praised the book nor those who criticized it can escape the most important premise. The autobiography is not an unbiased account of Sauk history and the events of 1832. At its foundation, it is a direct attempt by Black Hawk to present his version of events. He believed that he was misunderstood, and he knew that in 1833 he had lost his prominent position among his people. As much as it was possible, Black Hawk wanted to have a say in how he was viewed by people in 1833 and in the years that followed. Black Hawk's name. Although Black Hawk made an important statement with his autobiography, the appropriations of his name and image in the years since his death have usually overwhelmed his lone voice. For those who did not grow up in Illinois, Wisconsin, or Iowa, the name Black Hawk does not always have a direct historical connection. During the course of the 20th century, it has been affiliated with a number of different athletic teams, products, and geographic locations. As is the case with many prominent Indians of the past, Black Hawk's name and image have been used in a variety of ways. At least 4 different U.S. naval vessels have been designated the USS Black Hawk, and contemporary U.S. military operations often incorporate Black Hawk helicopters. Students can attend Black Hawk College in Illinois, drive-through 108, Black Hawk County, Iowa, and stay at the Black Hawk Motel in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. One of the more interesting references to the former Sauk in American pop culture comes in a song written by the musician Sufjan Stevens, entitled, The Black Hawk War, or, How to Demolish an Entire Civilization and Still Feel Good About Yourself in the Morning, or, We Apologize for the Inconvenience but You're Going to Have to Leave Now, or, One Have Fought the Big Knives and /V1LL Continue to Fight Them. The song does not have any lyrics, but Sufjan's title delivers his message clearly. Yet perhaps the most debated and well-known uses of Black Hawk are as a mascot. The use of Indians as mascots for college and professional athletic teams continues to be one of the most controversial and stereotypical uses of Indian images in the present day. Black Hawk has had a number of affiliations in this regard, though only one prominent connection remains. From 194 to 6 to 1951, the Tri-Cities Blackhawks were the basketball team that represented the 3 cities of Davenport, Iowa, and Moline and Rock Island, Illinois. The team joined the National Basketball Association in 194-9 and shortened its name to the Hawks in 1951, the name it still carries in Atlanta today. The Chicago Blackhawks of the National Hockey League have not changed their name. In 1926, the new owner, Frederick McLaughlin, decided to rename the hockey team he had purchased. From his perspective, the team he had purchased, the Portland Rosebuds, did not have a proper name for a team about to join the National Hockey League. The inspiration for the team's new name came from a combination of McLaughlin's military experience and the team's new home in Chicago. According to the team history, members of his division called themselves Black Hawks in honor of the Sauk Indian chief who sided with the British in the U.S. Congress passes the Northwest Ordinance. Meskwakes grant Iuli and Dubuque temporary rights to land on the western side of the Mississippi River. Louisiana Purchase made by the United States. 1825. Treaty Council at Prairie du Chien. 1803. Louisiana Purchase. 181-1. Battle of Tippecanoe. 1767. 1787. U.S. Congress passes the Northwest Ordinance. 1830. 181-6-1830 Sauk's and Congress Meskwakes sign passes peace treaty with Indian U.S. officials Removal Act. 1804. Sauk cede all of their land east of the Mississippi River. 1804. 1811. 1812. 1813. Chronology 117. Delegation of VE Sauk Indians signs a treaty ceding all Sauk lands east of the Mississippi River. U.S. Army under William Henry Harrison defeats Indian Confederacy under Tenskwatawa at the Battle of Tippecanoe. War begins between British and U.S. forces. Black Hawk and others ally with the British. Several bands of Sauks and Meskwakes avoid the War of 1812 by moving west of the Mississippi River. 1832. Battles of Stillman's Run, Wisconsin Heights, and Bad Axe. 1934. Sac and Fox of Missouri become a federally recognized tribe. 1867. Sauk cede all their 1,838 remaining Black Hall territory in Dyes, Kansas. 1832. Black Hawk tours Eastern Meskwakes Nation of Cities of United States lands in Iowa becomes. 1937. 1842. 1937. Sauks and Sac and Fox cede all their Oklahoma federally recognized. 118. 1816. 1818. 1822. 1825. 1827. 1829. 1830. 1831. 1832. Sauks and Meskwakes who allied with British negotiate and sign a peace treaty with U.S. officials. Illinois becomes a state. American miners set up camps along the Fever River. Treaty Council at Prairie du Chien takes place. Members of the Prairie La Crosse Band of Ho-Chunks attack settlers north of Prairie du Chien. U.S. government begins to sell Sauk lands on the Rock River. May Congress passes the Indian Removal Act. 6 companies of infantry under Major General Edmund P. Gaines force Black Hawks Band to abandon Saukenuk. April 6. Black Hawks Band of Sauks and Meskwakes crosses the Mississippi River into Illinois. April 15. Governor Owen Reynolds of Illinois calls out the state militia. May 14. British Band of Sauks and Meskwakes fight the Illinois militia during what becomes known as the Battle of Stillman's Run. June 18. Battle of Kellogg's Grove, where 80 Sauk warriors fight a company of Illinois militia. June 24. Black Hawk leads 200 Sauk men against a fort on the Apple River in northwestern Illinois. July 18. Scouts from Colonel Henry Dodge's force of volunteers and militia find a fresh trail from Black Hawk's band. 1833. 1838. 1842. 1857. 1859. 1867. 1896. Chronology 119. July 21. Dodge's men engage Black Hawk's band at the Battle of Wisconsin Heights. August 1. Black Hawk's band reaches the Mississippi River at a point just south of the mouth of the Bad Axe River. The steamboat Warrior fires upon them. Black Hawk heads north to the Ho-Chunk villages. August 2. Before dawn, U.S. soldiers under Atkinson attack the Sauks and Meskwakes still encamped on the banks of the river. Fighting lasts for nearly 8 hours and results in at least 300 Sauk and Meskwake deaths. August 27. Black Hawk and Wabokee surrender to Iosef Street at Prairie du Chien. September. Sauks and Meskwakes sign treaty that cedes land on western side of Mississippi River. April. Black Hawk, Neapope, W/Abokee, and 3 others begin their journey east to Washington, D.C. June 5. Black Hawk and other captives begin their tour of the eastern cities. October 3. Black Hawk dies. Sauks and Meskwakes sign a treaty that cedes their land in Iowa. They agree to remove to Kansas in 3 years. Meskwake band purchases 80-acre plot of land near Tama, Iowa. Sauks in Kansas sign treaty ceding a portion of their reservation to the United States. Sacs in Kansas sign a treaty ceding their remaining lands in that state. State of Iowa surrenders its jurisdictional authority over the settlement of Meskwaki Indians at Tama to the federal government. Sac and Fox of Missouri become a federally recognized tribe under the Indian Reorganization Act. Sac and Fox Nation of Oklahoma raises a constitution that marks them as a federally recognized tribe. Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri opens Tribal Museum and Research Center in Reserve, Kansas. Sac and Fox Tribe of the Mississippi in Iowa unveil a new $110 million extension to their successful hotel and casino in Tama, Iowa.